where Mercutio and Benvolio, they are talking back and forth. So they've been left by Romeo and they're really frustrated about it. So Mercutio, his friend, says, "Where the devil should this Romeo be? Came he not home tonight?" Benvolio answers and says, and this is his cousin, "Not to his father's I spoke with his man," meaning he spoke to his servant and Romeo didn't come home last night. Mercutio says, "Why, that same pale, hard-hearted wench that Rosaline torments him so, and he will sure run mad. Tybalt, the kinsman to old Capulet, has sent a letter to his father's house, a challenge on my life. Romeo will answer it. Any man that can write may answer a letter. Nay, he will answer the letter's master how he dares, being dared. Alas, poor Romeo, he is already dead, stabbed with a white wench's black eye, shot through the ear with a love song, the very pin of his heart cleft with a blind bow boy's butt shaft. And is he a man to encounter Tybalt? Why, what is Tybalt?" So far they're just talking about Romeo, and so something's happened kind of behind the scenes. So Romeo has received a letter, but he hasn't been home yet, so he doesn't even know about it. And so they think that he's been kept out all night by Rosaline, and that he's still chasing after her, and he's heartsick. And so behind the scenes, Tybalt has sent a challenge to a duel to Romeo's house that he doesn't know about yet. And so this is all about, remember at the party he said that he was going to get revenge. So he swore that he was so angry that Romeo had crashed the party that he was going to get, because he tried to kill him at the party and his uncle had stopped him. So Capulet had stopped him. So now this is what happened because of that. And so they're kind of wondering, like if Romeo is going to accept the duel, if he's going to accept the challenge for a fight. And so then Mercutio, he says, well, Romeo, he's basically already been stabbed through by Cupid's arrow, that he's so in love with Rosaline that it's basically already killed him. So they said that he has been shot by the blind bow boy's butt shaft, which is like Cupid's practice arrow. And so then when Mercutio asks, is Romeo a man to encounter Tybalt? So they're saying like, all right, is he good enough to actually fight Tybalt? Does he have a chance? And then Benvolio says, well, why, what is Tybalt? Meaning like, well, what's he about? Who is he? And Mercutio says, well, he's more than the prince of cats. Oh, he's the courageous captain of compliments. He fights as you sing prick song, keeps time, distance, and proportion. He rests his men in rest, 1, 2, and the third in your bosom. The very butcher of a silk button, a duelist, a gentleman of the very first house and the first and second cause, all the immortal passato, the punto reverso, the high. So he is very agile like a cat. And so it says that he knows, basically he fights by the book. So he knows all the rules. He's very good at sword fighting. And he is the butcher of a silk button. So meaning that he can actually take his sword and like clip off buttons from your shirt if he wants to. So he's very precise. So they're saying, yes, he's a very good sword fighter. So then Benvolio said, the what? And Mercutio answers, the pox of such antic lisping affecting phantasmos, these new tuners of accents. By Jesu, a very good blade, a very tall man, a very good whore. Why is it not this a lamentable thing, grandsire, that we should be thus afflicted with these strange flies, these fashion mongers, these pardon me's, who stand so much on the new form, and they cannot sit at ease on the old bench? Oh, their bones, their bones. So basically Mercutio thinks all these new sword fighting techniques that are kind of pointless, and that, yeah, they're great and all, but there's also a lot of things that you can learn from the old way of sword fighting. So he says it makes him feel very old. So then Romeo comes in. So he just left Friar Lawrence's, and Benvolio says, here comes Romeo, here comes Romeo. And Mercutio says, without his roe, like a dried herring, O flesh, flesh, how art thou fishified? Now is he for the numbers that Petrarch flowed in. Lord to his lady was but a kitchen wench. Mary, she had a better love to berhyme her. Dido a dowdy, Cleopatra a gypsy, Helen and Hero Hildings and harlots. This be a grey eye or so, but not to the purpose. Senor Romeo, bonjour. There's a French salutation to your French slop. You gave us the counterfeit fairly last night. So Mercutio is obviously still upset that Romeo ditched them. He's saying that he's lost in his poetry, that Petrarch flowed in. Petrarch is like the style of poetry, and so like the sonnets. So he's saying that all these beautiful women in history, so like Laura and Dido and Cleopatra and Helen, Thisbe, so they were all these beautiful women, but they're nothing compared to Rosaline, in Romeo's eyes. And so when he says, you gave us the counterfeit fairly last night, so he's saying, well, you left us, and you shouldn't have. And Romeo says, good morrow to you both. What counterfeit did I give you? And Mercutio answers, the slip, sir, the slip. Can you not conceive? So he's saying, don't you understand that you gave us the slip last night, and we're kind of aggravated about it? And Romeo says, pardon, good Mercutio, my business was great, and in such a case as mine, a man may strain courtesy. So he's saying that he had basically more important things to do. Mercutio says, that's as much as to say, such a case as yours constrains a man to bow in the hams. Meaning to curtsy? Thou hast most kindly hit it. A most courteous exposition. Nay, I'm the very pink of courtesy. Pink for flower? Right. Why then is my pump well flowered? Sure wit, follow me this jest now, till thou hast worn out thy pump, and when the single soul of it is worn, the jest may remain, after the wearing solely singular. Oh, single soul jest, solely singular for the singleness. Come between us, good Benvolio, my wits faints. Switch and spurs, or I'll cry a match. Nay, if our wits run the wild goose chase, I am done, for thou hast more of the wild goose in one of thy wits than I am sure I have in my whole 5. Was I with you there for the goose? Thou wast never with me for anything when thou wast not there for the goose. I will bite thee by the ear for that jest. Nay, good goose, bite not. Thy wit is very bitter-sweeting. It is a most sharp sauce. And is it not well served into a sweet goose? Oh, here's a wit of Cheverel that stretches from an inch narrow to an ell broad. I stretch it out for that word broad, which added to the goose proves thee far and wide a broad goose. Why, is not this better than groaning for love? Now art thou sociable, now art thou Romeo, now art thou what thou art, by art as well as by nature. For this driveling love is like a great natural that runs lolling up and down to hide his bauble in a hole. So he's basically, that whole part, they're joking back and forth, doing a lot of wordplay, and so the goose, when they call each other the goose, they're calling each other basically an idiot, and so they're talking about how, like they're trying to outwit each other with wordplay. So that's mainly what that whole part is about. But the most important part is where Mercutio, he says, well, this is a lot better than groaning for love. He says that now, he was running around like an idiot, and now he's joking with his friends and he's being sociable. And so he says now he's acting like their friend Romeo. So he's basically saying he's glad to have his friend back. Then Benvolio gets involved and says, stop there, stop there. And Mercutio says, thou desirest me to stop my tail against the hair? And Benvolio says, thou wouldst else have made thy tail large. Mercutio says, well, oh, thou art deceived. I would have made it short, for I have come to the whole depth of my tail, and meant indeed to occupy the argument no longer. So Benvolio kind of wants him to stop kind of word playing back and forth. And then so Benvolio says, well, if I wouldn't have stopped, you would have never stopped. You would have made your tail very large. And Mercutio says, no, I'm finished. I hadn't planned to say anything more about it. And so then this is where the nurse comes in. And she comes in with her servant Peter. And so she's there to talk to Romeo about the marriage. So this is what this scene is. So Romeo says, here's goodly gear. And Benvolio says, a sail, a sail. Mercutio says, two, a shirt and a smock. And then the nurse says, Pita. And Peter says, anon. The nurse says, my fan, Pita. Mercutio says, good Peter to hide her face, for her fans the fair face. And so basically, they've already been kind of like making fun of each other, calling each other idiots. And so at this point, so when Benvolio sees the nurse, he says, a sail, meaning that she's kind of a larger woman. He says she looks like a sailboat coming in, with her skirts kind of billowing in the wind around her. And so then the nurse, she asks for her fan. And so then Mercutio, he says something very unkind. He says, yeah, she needs that fan to hide her face because the fan has a better face than she does. So they are now calling her ugly. So then the nurse says, God ye good morrow, gentlemen. And Mercutio says, God ye good e'en, fair gentlewoman. So remember, she's supposed to be there at 9 o'clock in the morning, and it's evening now. So she's late getting there. And the nurse says, is it good e'en? Meaning, is it good evening? And Mercutio says, 'tis no less, I tell you, for the body hand of the dial is now upon the prick of noon. And the nurse says, out upon you, what a man are you? Mercutio says, one gentlewoman that God hath made himself to mar. The nurse says, by my troth, it is well said, for himself to mar, quoth he. Gentlemen, can any of you tell me where I may find young Romeo? And Romeo answers, I can tell you, but young Romeo will be older when you have found him than he was when you sought him. I am the youngest of the name, for fault of the worse. So, the nurse is looking for Romeo, and so they're kind of making fun of her, and Mercutio, he kind of says something dirty about noontime, and kind of makes a rude gesture toward her. And so the nurse says, what kind of man are you? And Mercutio says, well, I'm somebody that even God made even for himself to make fun of. And so the nurse, she doesn't really understand what he's saying, so she says, well, that's a good quote. And she says, well, can you tell me where can I find Romeo? And Romeo, he is kind of joking too, and he says, well, I am the youngest of that name, but I'll be older when you find me than when you were first looking for me. So he's a little bit, smart aleck here. And the nurse says, you say well. And Mercutio says, yea is the worst well. Very well took of faith, wisely. And so then he says, well, the nurse really didn't understand his sarcasm, so it kind of went over her head. And the nurse says, if you be he, sir, I desire some confidence with you. And Benvolio says she will indict him to some supper. So the nurse says she wants to have a private conversation with Romeo, and Benvolio makes fun of her and says that she's just trying to get him to have dinner party, a dinner with him. So then Mercutio gets involved, and he says, abod, so ho. And Romeo says, well, what hast thou found? And Mercutio says, no hare, sir, a hare, sir, and a Lenten pie, that is something stale and hoar, ere it be spent. He sings, he says, an old hare whore is very good meat in Lent, but a hare that is hoar is too much for a score, when it whores ere it be spent. And then he says, Romeo, will you come to your father's will to dinner thither? And Romeo says, I will follow. So now this, it has a double meaning. So a hare is a rabbit, so H-A-R-E. And so he says that he's found this old, kind of like an old moldy rabbit that's only not really fit to eat. And so then he's kind of making fun of her. He's also calling her promiscuous and saying that she's kind of an old, nasty, promiscuous woman that nobody really wants. And so then he basically dances around her, makes fun of her, tortures her, and then he asks Romeo, he says, well, are you ready to go to your father's house and go to dinner? And Romeo at this point, he's like, I'll follow you later. And so he's a little bit embarrassed of how his friends have treated the nurse. Okay, and so then Mercutio says, farewell, ancient lady, farewell, lady, lady, lady. And so then he leaves with Benvolio. So then the nurse says, I pray you, sir, what saucy merchant was this that was so full of his ropery? And Romeo answers, a gentleman, nurse, that loves to hear himself talk, and will speak more in a minute than he will stand to in a month. And so the nurse is mad and wants to know who this guy was that was making all these vulgar jokes to her. And Romeo says, well, he just likes to hear himself talk. Don't pay attention to him. He talks a lot but says very little. And then the nurse says, and he speak anything against me, I'll take him down. And he were lustier than he is, and 20 such jacks. And if I cannot, I'll find those that shall. Scurvy knave, I am none of his flirt gills, I am none of his skeins mates. And then she turns to Peter, and she says, and thou must stand by too, and suffer every knave to use me at his pleasure. And then Peter answers, I saw no man use you at his pleasure. If I had, my weapon should quickly have been out, I warrant you. I dare draw as soon as another man, if I see occasion in a good quarrel, and the law of my side. So the nurse, she's so mad, and she says that she would take this guy down and 20 other men just like him for speaking anything badly against her. And she says that she's not any of the inappropriate or vulgar names that he called her, that she's not promiscuous. And then so she gets mad at Peter, and she says, Peter, how could you let him talk to me like that? And Peter says, I didn't really see anybody use you at his pleasure. I didn't see anything wrong. He says, but I am just as willing to basically like fight somebody, but only, if there's a good quarrel, a good fight, and if the law is on my side. So Peter's not really someone necessarily you'd want defending your honor. So that's her servant. So the nurse says, she says, now afore God, I am so vexed that every part of me quivers, scurvy knave. And then she turns to Romeo, she says, pray you, sir, a word. So she wants to talk to Romeo. And even though she's still pretty angry, she's so mad she's shaking. What she bade me say, I will keep to myself. But first let me tell ye, if ye should lead her in a fool's paradise, as they say, it were a very gross kind of behavior, as they say. For the gentlewoman is young, and therefore, if you should deal double with her, truly it were an ill thing to be offered to any gentlewoman, and very weak dealing. So the nurse is kind of worried that Romeo's dealing double with her, which is basically saying like that he's leading her on. And that was a very terrible thing to do because Juliet's young, she's very inexperienced, and so that now that the nurse has met Romeo's friends, she's kind of worried that maybe Romeo's kind of like them and he's uncivilized and he's just kind of he's teasing Juliet and kind of leading her on, but he's not really serious. So Romeo, he says, nurse, commend me to thy lady and mistress, I protest unto thee. And the nurse says, good heart of faith, I will tell her as much. Lord, she will be a joyful woman. Romeo answers, what wilt thou tell her, nurse? Thou dost not mark me. So Romeo, he says, I protest, and then the nurse interrupts him and says, well, she'll be so happy. And then Romeo says, well, what are you going to tell her? You didn't even listen to what I was going to say. You didn't mark me. And the nurse says, I will tell her, sir, that you do protest, which, as I take it, is a gentlemanlike offer. Then Romeo says, bid her devise some means to come to Shrift this afternoon, and there she shall at Friar Lawrence's cell be shrived and married. Then he gives her some money, and he says, here is for thy pains. And the nurse says, no, truly, sir, not a penny. And Romeo says, go to, I say you shall. And the nurse takes the money, and she says, this afternoon, sir. Well, she shall be there. So the nurse, she says, well, you protested, and that sounds like a gentlemanly thing to do. And so then Romeo, he says, well, tell Juliet to pretend that she's going to confession this afternoon, and really she's going to be married. And so that's how she's going to get out of the house. What she's going to tell her parents is that she's really going to go confess to a priest, but really she's going to go to Friar Lawrence's. And so then he tries to give the nurse money. The nurse won't take the money, and then she does. And then the nurse says, well, she will be there at the church this afternoon. And then Romeo, he says, and stay, good nurse, behind the abbey wall. Within this hour my man shall be with thee, and bring thee cords made like a tackled stair, which to the high topgallant of my joy must be my convoy in the secret night. Farewell, be trusty, and I'll quit thy pains. Farewell, commend me to thy mistress. And the nurse says, now God in heaven bless thee. Hark you, sir. And then Romeo says, what sayest thou, my dear nurse? And the nurse says, is your man secret? Did you ne'er hear say, two may keep counsel, putting one away? And Romeo says, warrant thee, my man's as true as steel. So the nurse is kind of worried that that Romeo, whoever he tells about this marriage, that they're not going to be secret and they're going to tell somebody. He says, and so he says, well, my man is true as steel, meaning that this guy is going to be trusted. So the nurse, she's going to, so this servant is going to give the nurse a rope ladder, and that way Romeo can get up to Juliet's room after they're married. And so he says, if you do this, then I'll quit your pain, so that he will pay her if she'll be trustworthy. Okay, so then the nurse says, well, sir, my mistress is the sweetest lady, Lord, when 'twas a little prating thing. Oh, there is a nobleman in town, one Paris, that would fain lay knife aboard, but she, good soul, has lief see a toad, a very toad as see him. I anger her sometimes and tell her that Paris is the proper man. But I'll warrant you, when I say so, she looks as pale as any clout in the versal world. Doth not Rosemary and Romeo begin both with a letter? Ay, nurse, what of that? Both with an R. Ah, mocker, that's the dog's name. R is for the... No, I know it begins with some other letter, and she hath the prettiest sententious of it, of you and Rosemary, that it would do good to hear it. Commend me to thy lady. Ah, 1,000 times. Peter! Anon. Before and apace. So, at this point, so the nurse says that, you know, her lady is very sweet, and then he, as kind of like an afterthought, the nurse tells Romeo about Paris. Now remember, Paris is the guy that wants to marry Juliet. He's already asked her dad. He was with her at the Capulet party. So he already has his foot in the door. And so the nurse says, well, he would fain lay knife aboard, so meaning that he would kill someone if they were trying to move in on Juliet behind his back. And so then the nurse, she basically tries to smooth things over and says, well, Juliet doesn't really like him, and that she would rather see a toad than to see Paris. And then she starts to talk about these poems that Juliet's been writing about Romeo and rhyming Rosemary and Romeo, and that it would do him good to hear it. And then so Romeo says, well, you know, tell Juliet, commend me to thy lady, tell her that, you know, tell her good things about me. And so now the nurse leaves to go home to tell Juliet the good news.